All right, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. Can you all hear me? Nod your heads. Okay. I could play a really great game with you now. Everybody, right foot to the right, then to the center. We're all going to dance. So I'm Valerie Langer. I'm with CANOPY, a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to forest conservation. And we work to transform the unsustainable supply chains for paper packaging and lyocell, viscose type textiles in order to protect the world's climate, forest biodiversity, and work with frontline indigenous communities to make sure that their home and the habitats of the species in these forests are not destroyed. And so this leads us back to a conversation about how we can transform the way in which materials are made, which is why you are all here. And welcome and thank you and congratulations for showing up because half of the work of making change in the world is actually showing up and figuring out what needs to be done, figuring out what the problems are, and then how to leapfrog those problems to be part of solutions. So I thank you all for being here. I have a wonderful group of panelists here we've got about 30 minutes for us to talk about the power of collective demand. So we're calling this session Scaling Together. Because obviously you can have great innovations, but if nobody buys it, it goes nowhere. And so in CANOPY, we say that our Valhalla, the top of the mountain that we're getting to, is to make it possible for brands to buy the materials, the low carbon and circular materials that they want. But getting what you want is not as easily as just saying, I want it. Something else has to change. It's a system. So we're going to talk about the power of collective demand, what each one of you does individually, but works its way up into a very powerful force. So with me today, I have Priyanka Khanna from Fashion for Good. One of our ally partners, a longtime innovator in a different sense, not innovator in terms of being a technical innovator, but like an ideas innovator, an accelerator. But let's move to what actual innovation from a technology point of view is. And Arshiya Lal from Circ, who's made a very exciting announcement you're going to tell us about later. And then we have Nicklas Borgen, who is with Upward. It's a fascinating digital platform that's going to facilitate all of you to get what you want. So with that little mystery, I'll start us off on our conversation. And first, maybe Priyanka, if you could introduce a little bit more about what is Fashion for Good. And then after you've explained that, if you could talk a little bit about what are some of the interesting elements of collective demand that are the developments in this idea of collective demand that you see coming forward, and how it relates to the marketplace and market pull-through.
Thank you. And I think a lot of people know us here, but for those who don't, I'm from Fashion for Good. We're essentially a social enterprise. We're a mission-driven organization that's looking to transform the fashion industry with the lens of innovation. So we're an innovation platform that works with a lot of innovations like Circ here and many, many more in the room. We support maybe to date about 180 plus technologies. And on the other side, we work with a set of very agile, very forward-looking brands who are saying, how do we make this transition possible? How do we support these technologies to bring them to market, to bring them to scale, as Valerie mentioned earlier, which means that we kind of sit in the center of this very, very exciting shift that you see in the industry where innovations are moving forward. Brands are starting to figure out what these business models are and how we can adopt them. And the supply chain, the very key essential player here, is trying to figure out where their role is and how they can assist in that entire process. So lots and lots of other stakeholders that I haven't mentioned, but we have this very exciting spot in the industry where we sit in the center and see what kind of enabling role can we play. With respect to various examples of collective action or collective demand, particularly on the material side, I think I remember last year at this stage itself, we spoke about some of the models, potential buyers alliances. We spoke about one of the work that we are deriving with CANOPY on creating a bit of a price parity playbook or a toolkit. And now I think we're here a year later with a lot of case studies, quite a few case studies actually, to see that there is real movement in the industries and that collective action is actually happening. And that pre-competitive action case studies, I think maybe starting with Circ Fiber Club. Arshiya will talk about this a little bit more. But that itself is an indicator that the very traditional formats of supply chains, which are not as streamlined, brands want certain suppliers, certain specs, and certain material mixes. That ideology from a brand's perspective is changing. They are now open to this collaborative action when materials are when the supply chain is a bit more streamlined, and that becomes a stepping stone to actually get these materials to market. And Circ Fiber Club is a great example. We are now observing more and more such buyers alliances coming together this year. I think you will hear about 2 or 3 more, which will exactly target that how do we not just aggregate demand and see economies of scale happening, but really see a more streamlined supply chain to get these to market. I think another great example is also in the past, we've seen materials aren't necessarily getting absorbed, even as the technologies grow, because price is a big challenge. Price parity will always be something that the industry, fashion industry at large, the supply chain, the brands, are sensitive towards. And I think we've now seen examples of how these can be navigated. We also see that as one of our roles to come up with newer business models and assist these technologies in saying, how do we get to price parity faster or enable a condition that the supply chain isn't struggling and we can make the supply chain work with business as usual. And I think last week's announcement with Circulars and Mango is a good example of how newer business models can work. And as we get more brands engaged in that, I think that will also be a very good example of collective actions to drive newer business models. And we hope to see multiple other innovators now driving similar models as well. And then maybe last, one more example of collective action is case studies on the investment side. We've seen a lot of investments ad hoc with brands investing into different technologies, equity investments to actually support these technologies. But now you see more and more case studies of brands collectively coming together within and pushing one technology as well. And what that means is it creates more signal for the market to actually, for institutional investors to come in because it gives them some level of comfort and guarantee that yes, these technologies will be backed forward, but it also helps further streamline the demand or assure the demand of these technologies. So I think maybe another case study around this would be Infinited Fiber. I mean, they closed a 40 million round with 4 or 5 of the largest brands, but also with a couple of key supply chain players. So you see collectively the industry is making lots of action, and wow, we feel we are closer and closer to pull through. And if I reflect back what everything we discussed last year and last year on this stage, I think there is massive, I wouldn't say totally leapfrog, but there's a massive movement in the industry towards pull through.
Right. So the industry has, as there's been a development. First, it was just like, what is the technology? Is it possible to, take an item of clothing and circle it back into the system? And it was all like focused on the technology. And we're kind of evolving. We've got these technologies that are actually capable of doing that, and we're solving for a different set of problems. We're not solving for technology so much as solving for how do you actually get that technology to scale. In order to scale, everybody that needs to be a part of that supply chain has to feel confident and step forward. So this kind of whether it's stepping forward by enabling scale by financing, or stepping forward by creating some sort of supply chain like the offtakes. And so maybe, Arshiya, if you can talk a little bit about who is Circ, what do you do, for those of you who don't know? What is Circ capable of? And then the Circ Fiber Club, why this particular innovation as a company at this point?
Yeah, definitely. And I really mirror everything that was just spoken about. So Circ is a chemical textile recycler. We are focused specifically on blended textile waste. So we really saw in the market there's quite a lot of recyclers focused on both mechanical and chemically recycling monomaterials such as cotton, such as polyester. But the fact is that a majority of the materials in market are blends, especially synthetic cellulosic blends. So something like poly with cotton. So our specific technology is able to take poly cotton blends specifically and basically separate the polyester from the cotton. The polyester is then depolymerized back into the original monomers, the original building blocks of polyester, and then rebuilt again into fresh PET chip to be taken back into new fibers and back into the fashion industry. And then the cellulose side, so that cotton element, we take into man-made cellulosic fibers. So we use that cotton, clean it up, and use it as a pulp to replace wood pulp within man-made cellulosic fibers, such as lyocell, viscose, these kinds. And we have been operating at a pilot scale for the last couple of years in Virginia, in the U.S. And we're really excited to be announcing our first factory. This is going to be our first commercial scale factory to practice this technology, which will be built in France to be open in 2028 and with the backing of the French government. So that has been quite an exciting milestone for Circ, something we've been working towards for a long time, and also starts to be able to fulfill our vision to bring these recycled fibers and these recycled materials into the lines of many fashion brands and really complete that full circularity model. On the same vein, we have worked with brands for a long time, and we started to see some issues in that ability to go from pilot to scale. I think one of those key issues was the fact that the fashion supply chain operates on high minimums, high order quantities, and oftentimes a brand who has a desire to pilot is unsure as to how to pilot with those minimums in mind. So they want to do something smaller, prove out the material. How do they do that? Another challenge we saw was a little bit of lack of clarity in how to go from pilot to scale. So how do you start proving out a new fiber, but also figure out if it's going to slot into different core collections? How do you really follow that path, and how do you bring your supply chain along? And the last thing we saw was that brands, especially I'm sure stakeholders, many of you sitting in this room, have to really champion a next-gen fiber in their company to many different stakeholders in order to get alignment. So we saw these three kind of different challenges at Circ, and then in partnership with CANOPY and Fashion for Good, put together a framework that we call Fiber Club, which is really a framework to aggregate demand from many brands to overcome some of these challenges. We started our first Fiber Club, was announced last year at Textile Exchange with Everlane, Eileen Fisher, Zalando, Bestseller. And they're basically coming together, pooling demand at both the fiber stage and at the spinning stage so that we can overcome minimums on those two parts of the supply chain. And then we are basically going through a milestone-based process where we go from pilot to scale with those brands. So this is really helping to overcome some of the challenges in minimums. So because we're pooling demand at that fiber stage, at that yarn stage, we're able to overcome those minimums. We're working very closely with a couple select supply chain partners, both on the fiber manufacturing and the mill side, and really stepping these brands through a milestone-based process to go from pilot to scale up. In addition to that, because there are many brands involved, it has helped to convince internal stakeholders at brands that, our peers are doing this, we're working on this together with other brands, let's actually make this commitment and start to move forward. So it's just been an amazing framework and tool to really solve some of those MOQ issues in piloting, and also to bring together brands, bring together mind share, and start to overcome the challenges of really championing a new fiber at a brand and really starting to get it from pilot to scale.
And thanks. So you just mentioned MOQ, and I just
sorry.
want to get a sense from the audience first. How many of you here are from brands that buy generally at the garment level, and so when you do your purchases, you're doing it at garment level, and how many of you nominate all the way back down to like the spinner level? And a few of you. So. And how many of you are from brands that, let's say on man-made cellulosic fibers, you buy less than 500 tons a year? Yeah. Anybody up around 10,000 tons a year? Zero? You know that there are 7 million tons of man-made cellulosic fibers made every year. So if you can do the math, right? So if most brands are buying at under 500 tons or 500 to 1,000 tons, it's going to take thousands. You can do the math, thousands and thousands of brands. And so this idea of an MOQ is actually critical to this conversation that we're having here. And that's why we're talking about aggregating demand. So that leads me to this next, some unique tools that we're talking about. So Nicklas, maybe if you give us a little insight into who is Upward and what do you do? What's the unique element?
Absolutely. Yeah. So eventually we came from a VC perspective at Lookup Ventures. We've been investing a lot in climate and fashion in particularly. And what we saw, not only in fashion, but actually across industries, is this first-of-a-kind financing gap. Everyone has a really great time raising funding up to Series A stage, but they need that massive $50 to $100 million to build their first factory and really scale their production globally. And VCs are traditionally out because they don't write such big checks. And banks, they have the money, but they just think the risk is too big because you haven't even built your first factory. So that was the initial problem that we were trying to solve at Upward. We were looking, can we build a platform? Because we know that offtake agreements are the bridge to bankability, going from that Series A stage and raising the money needed to build that first factory. So yeah, at Upward, can we build like a neutral platform where we can aggregate brand demand and essentially de-risk offtake agreements? We found 4 key problems to why big brands wouldn't sign offtake agreements at the scale that we would hope for to really support innovators at large. One of them was supply chain complexity. A lot of the brands are in their tier 0, only speak to their tier 1 suppliers. But much of the innovation is happening way further down in the value chain, tier 4, tier 5. So how do you sort of bridge that complexity for brands? The other one was compounding price premiums. How do you lock in a price, not only on a future material, but also a material that has to move through a lot of different intermediaries? Another problem that we saw was just the inherent risk for brands to work with an offtake agreement with one supplier, because it's almost like a little bit of a VC game for them. They really have to pick the right supplier in order for them to get the material that they are betting on. So at Upward, trying to build a neutral platform, de-risking offtake agreements, doing it by aggregating brand demand and helping solve some of these problems. For example, with the compounding price premiums, can you log in an indexed pricing that not only the innovator and the brand taps into, but potentially the whole value chain and all the intermediaries in between? Is there a scenario or world where a brand can bet on an index of suppliers within a given material, so they actually bet on the one who is producing the fastest or can deliver to the qualities that they are, the quality standards that they have internally? And I think more importantly, standardization. What we have experienced a lot is also big brands have many different ways of doing quality assurance or even engaging in offtake agreements. So can there be, as you see in venture capital, we have this safe note for when you're investing in startups, sort of a unified framework that everyone knows and can tap into. Is it possible to build something similar for offtake agreements? That's what we have been diving deep into, researching, and are trying to build out at Upward.
And this is software.
It's a software play, but trying to solve many of the underlying problems that we're talking about here. And why software? It's basically seeing the need for a neutral platform that's not tied to a particular innovator or brand, but where multiple stakeholders can come together into a platform or a company that doesn't necessarily have incentives either way in the supply chain.
Right. That's cool. So to circle back around, Priyanka, because so you're both companies that are working like a manufacturing company and a platform, a technology platform, which is connective tissue, and then you've got fashion for good, which is kind of a connective tissue in an enabling sense, looking at from innovation in in the scaling manner. And so, what do you see from a fashion for good perspective across all of these different materials that you're working with? What do you see as how fashion for good plays in this space that enables, sometimes it could be seen as competitors to each other, but when scaling is first happened, everybody kind of needs a little something. Like, what is that kind of offering that fashion for good does that enables something that's kind of novel around pricing and volumes to happen?
I think the keyword there is enable, which is basically 100% our function. And I think the lens that we take when we look at scaling journey and where we can support is really understanding where are the roadblocks. When we started our journey about 7.5 years back, we thought by testing technologies and bringing together with the brands and exposing them to industry players, we should be able to move the needle. And as we went past that journey, we realized actually scaling challenges come after that journey is over, after you've done your original validation, after you've tested and you know that the solution works from a technology, the specs, but also from a impact perspective, which is a very strong lens of what fashion for good looks at, right? Because not every solution will necessarily bring the emissions down. There are some solutions for water, some solutions for emissions. So impact becomes a very core component of what we do. But once we went over the line there, the natural offtake or uptake of technologies that we thought would happen didn't happen, because that's when we discovered where scaling barriers come in. Whether it comes in as price, whether it comes in at where the facility comes in and who are the right supply chain partners, because there are thousands and millions of suppliers in this world. None of the technologies are capable of working with everybody, but industry or brands work with everybody. So how do we streamline and bring the right stakeholders to the table that will help amplify this rather than spreading everybody too thin across everybody, every supply chain and every region. So I think our enabling role sort of starts where we see scaling roadblocks and where we step in. So to start with, it was really on helping industry understand where the impact is and what can be validated, which materials work for which performance steps. And then the second part is really around getting the right supply chain, getting investments through. Now we are talking about larger facility-based investments, like Circ's talking about 500 million. But I think we are coming from a time where the first seed round and the Series A round were also challenges. There was a lot around catalyzing investors and creating a narrative of why sustainable technologies in fashion make sense. And I think the frontiers we are tackling now is particularly as technologies like Circ, Circulars, IFC, they all come closer to market, then how do you make that offtake happens by tackling price? After years and years of brand conversations, whether we like it or not, this industry will always have the price sensitivity. So our role really becomes as how do we navigate those challenges, whether it comes from aggregating demand so we can create economies of scale, whether it comes from streamlined supply chains so that we're not now spreading everything too thin and targeting a couple of suppliers that we can pool volume with, or looking at these decoupling, premium decoupling mechanisms to see how do we make sure that we can keep the premium part, which is temporary, aside and actually let the supply chain run as in. And this is a piece of work with CANOPY that we are hoping to also launch this year, which will talk about how these mechanisms work. How do we almost license out the premiums and say, let the industry run as it runs? So I think our enabling role is to also develop newer business models and newer pricing models for the industry. But then problem statements can go beyond. If we talk about recyclers, we are looking at textile waste. Textile waste is a ridiculously big challenge for all of the recyclers sitting here. I think there are quite a few here. Everybody will agree with me that textile waste, until we sort out the access of textile waste, the purity of textile waste, and the economics of textile waste, which nobody necessarily is fully cracking now, we will not be able to bring the price down to the parity level or to the premium levels that can be observed in the fashion industry. So a lot of our efforts, whether it's sitting in India, whether it's sitting in Europe, is really coming at from post-industrial to post-consumer. How do we take that as a problem statement and build the ecosystem around it so we can actually drive the cost down? So from a larger perspective, we are saying we need to drive the sustainability cost curve for all of these innovations. It's kind of our narrative that we need to bend that sustainability cost curve, and it could come in various shapes and forms. It could come in navigating and creating access to textile waste. It could come with these price parity and premium models, and it could come with investments and other models. So I think how we differ a lot from everybody else is that we have that flexibility to say, based on the challenge that comes in, we want to tackle it accordingly. And which is great because we get to work with technologies like Upward, we get to work with innovators like Circ, as well as yourself. So I think we are maybe a much more agile ecosystem player in the market that's looking to solve whatever technological challenges will come through.
And when we, as I said earlier, when we go back years and it was all about the technology and it's like, can this be done? And then all of a sudden you get it and there's like the next challenge ahead of you. So I'm sure that's exactly happening with Fiber Club, where you develop a model and then you have the conversations with the brands, and then there's the feedback about, well, here's how I work, or here's how I like to purchase, or here's how I will collaborate, or here's the things I won't collaborate on, but I want to have the advantage of something that you're offering. So I'm just wondering from, it's been a little while now since you launched Fiber Club, and what are some of the key learnings out of that? And if you're doing Fiber Club too, is there anything that you will change in your Fiber Club model based on the feedback that's happened?
Yeah, definitely. I think number one, I would say the brands, there is definitely power in numbers, I would say. Like it's quite interesting that when brands come to the table, there is this collective momentum of we're all sort of struggling through the same things. We're really trying to get this off the ground. And, we have brands who we've talked to for a long time who this really was the lever to be able to do something and be able to solve some of the challenges they were facing. So I think that number one, it's a continue to do, because we really see there is power in the collective. There is momentum in the collective. That being said, of course, when it comes to design and when it comes to fabric creation, that's not something necessarily all brands are going to share with each other. That is where each brand has their own creativity, their own flavor they want to bring into the materials. But I think Circ being really a raw material company, a fiber recycled material company, we have so many supply chain players who start to refine and bring out the different creativity of brands. And so really what we found is with Fiber Club, we're aggregating demand on the fiber production level and on the yarn spinning level. And those are two places where there isn't necessarily creativity lost that much. And then for fabric creation, that is where each brand wants to sort of do their own thing and work within one yarn type, but be a little bit creative, feel like they can make it their own. And so I think that's something that's just important to recognize, which we, learned is you can't really curb the design side. You want to encourage it. We want people to see this fiber slotting to as many things as possible. And so that's something we encourage. However, in order to pool demand, we try to aggregate on the fiber and yarn level for this.
So when you're on the so at the yarn level, so are you finding that if you say like I want if we could all make a 41S,
Yeah.
really common, something very common that would make it easier for you. Are you counting on those brands within your fiber club to then buy all of that, or are you making something where they create enough of an anchor and then you produce more and that goes out to the rest of the brand, the fashion community, or do you need the brands to like say, okay, this is what we're gonna at this level we're gonna buy the same fiber and maybe a particular yarn type, and then we'll get creative on what kind of fabric that goes into, and do they have to buy all of it? All right.
Yeah.
So how much are you counting on your fiber club members to purchase, or an anchoring amount or the total amount?
Yeah, so in terms of how we're kind of dealing with that, I would say the really selecting one yarn type is really to aggregate demand on the pilot scale. And that's where a lot of brands hit those minimum order quantity challenges, is in order to pilot, both based on the amount of fiber to pilot with and based on, how big they want that first collection to be. That's where you start to face some of those minimum orders. I think the idea is that this is really a proof point for understanding how this is going to slot into your core fabrications, into yardage you're running often and in large volumes. And so this proof point is really where we're aggregating demand. But the idea is to start to understand then, with your designers, with your mill partners, hey, if it works in this, what if we could start to bring this into this core collection that we've been running for quite some time? What if we could swap out just 20% of that with recycled fiber? And those conversations really relate more to sourcing from our commercial scale factory where we have those volumes. So that's really how the process works. And I think what's been nice is to have really this milestone-based process, which is right now the focus is on the pilot and understanding how this material works, how the mill's feedback on the fiber, how did we, put it into the fabrications we're looking at with this certain yarn type. And then if that works, how can we scale this out to other collections, other fabrics in our brand's repository? And I would also say in terms of an anchoring amount, that's where the pooling also really helps, is each brand is both working on a pilot, but also has the ability to commit to sourcing volumes from the commercial scale facility. And we've sort of set aside a certain amount of volume to say, hey, this is available for Fiber Club brands. How much of this larger volume will you be taking? And it really provides a very clear roadmap to be able to understand, okay, there's worked at this scale. We can actually see it going to this scale.
Thanks. So about 80% of the purchases of garments, textiles in the world is with small and medium-sized enterprises, but the majority of the companies that we actually get to work with, who have big innovation dollars, and they're the bigger brands, but they actually only buy maybe 20%, the big brands. So we really need small and medium-sized enterprises to come in, especially to get those MOQs. And so, just wondering how the capability of the platform that Nicklas, that Upward is looking at, how that would work for SMEs in particular.
100%.
Yeah.
It's definitely something that we have been envisioning. How can we long tail the brand demand? Because as you rightly mentioned, these offtake agreements are really for the big corporates at this point, because there's so much complexity going into the agreements. A concept that we have been exploring is, can there be a lead buyer, ideally some of the bigger brands, going through the process of doing the quality assurance, setting the pricing index, and lots of the groundwork for structuring the offtake agreement, but then opening it up to the long tail of brands in order to maybe the the lead buyer will get a certain discount for doing all of the due diligence, all of the groundwork, but actually opening up that agreement to smaller brands, and thus enabling the smaller brands to actually tap into offtake agreements so they don't have to go through the legal complexity, nominating supply chain partners, quality assurance, all of these different things, because then it starts to get really interesting and we can start aggregating really large volumes of demand, but also unlock markets for many of the SMEs out there in the world who also want to tap into innovation, but in many cases just don't have the ability internally to even go through this process. So it's definitely a concept. We're still early, but something that we have explored and gotten some early early thoughts on.
Yeah, exciting. I realize we have about 10 minutes left, and we want to make sure that there's a little bit of time for anybody in the audience. And there is an app, apparently, that I'll see if there's any questions that have come up yet. And if you haven't, I'm actually looking to see if anybody here knows about the app. There we go. QR code. They put me in charge of this technology thing, and like anybody who knows me would know that that is the worst idea. I generally don't interact very well. That's his realm. But if you get the QR code, I will be able to see your questions in a second if you want to pop one to me. Anybody coming in? Not so far. I'll give you a few seconds to download. Was it? Well, there's no questions coming up yet. That's all. Yeah. Okay. They'll come up. Okay. Okay. All right. No, I don't see anything. That's fine. So we'll, I don't know if somebody has put something in that hasn't shown up. Put up your hand if you put something in, because it isn't showing up here yet. Marie. It's not showing up, whoever the tech person is. So maybe you can just shout it out. Why don't we start here? Yeah. There's nothing showing up there.
Oh.
Yeah, because it's not showing up at all on the iPad. Okay, I do have some questions, but start, Marie. Why don't you start first? Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So if you had, all of you, if you had a one goal
no, it's not
to
really
set...
working.
Doesn't work?
I can't hear her at all.
It's because you need a set of...
Yeah, but you're... Can you see anything showing up on this? There were some on hers, but not on here. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. If you had one goal to set for next year's FFE, what would it be? It's a question for everyone.
If you had one goal to set for next year's Future Fabric Expo, what would it be? They just came up. Okay.
I think I would love to see more demand signaling in the market from the different brands. Up until this point, we have seen there's a lot of lengthy processes for many of the innovators to both get in touch with many of the big brands, but also a massive variation of the different quality assurance processes and ways of working in terms of engaging in these offtakes. So in a year from now, I would love to see like actually substantiated demand, but hopefully also a unified framework that all of the innovators can tap into.
I would love to see that. But also, I think, I will say, I do think there is momentum on the brand side. I think we are starting to see a lot of brands coming to the table on offtakes, really starting to explore different business models in their company, figuring out which teams to put together internally to tackle offtakes. So brands are doing it. I think that's amazing. I think, of course, any innovator, we're moving quickly. We are setting up a facility. So I think converting a lot of that interest into, long-term agreements is, of course, probably what any innovator would say to this question. But I think in that same vein, creativity around frameworks within brands, around where this, where this pricing is going to come within a brand, who needs to be involved in making these decisions. And I think we're starting to see a lot of creativity on the brand side in trying to solve this problem. So I think more of that, and of course, off takes and future facing agreements is definitely what I hope to see next year.
Great. On my end, I'd say something slightly different, even though I agree. But I think offtakes as we know it, as of today, I think still are very obsolete. And while we need the offtakes or maybe more adoption agreements, I think we really need to change the way it looks. We need to have those streamlined supply chains in. We need to have maybe contained fiber specs in. And I think so. What I would love to see is new age offtakes, but like lots of them coming, because no matter what, there are a lot of brands and industry players that have been burned by traditional conventional offtake agreements. So it would be nice to see the new age version of that.
Yeah.
But also adding that I would love to see maybe 5 or 6 or maybe 50% of the innovators here driving the Fiber Club aggregation model, because it does really solve problems for brands. Brands do give up something, but also they gain a lot through these models. So would love to see more of that.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that as well, which is on the thought of Fiber Club, we have had so much demand for it that we are also starting to source demand now for the next Fiber Club, so Fiber Club 2.0. So definitely, if any brands are interested in that model, working closely with us to really pilot these new fibers, these new textile recycled fibers, definitely reach out.
Yeah, and so if I will add and then segue into the next question. For next year's Future Fabric Expo, if we could think more in terms of consortium approach to how we move circularity forward. So it's, we all want brands to do X, and then we all want, investors to do Y, so they are separate from each other. But in fact, it's an entire system. And the entire value chain has to move together. You have to have the textile recycling capacity, then you have to have the technology that can actually take those textiles and turn them into the circular material, and then you have to have the next level of in the supplier, the mills that can process it, et cetera. So you have to have we have to have these cross dialogues and collaborations that are more consortia focused. I think for next Future Fabric Expo, that would be a great topic. And that's going to move me into the next question that came through here, which is for you, Arshiya, which is around small and medium-sized enterprises. Is there a way for SMEs to actually engage in Fiber Club?
Yeah, so I think definitely. I think it depends holistically on what the scope is. Our main focus is to make sure that what we do isn't a one-off, and it has capacity to scale, and it has capacity to really have committed volumes down the line. I think that commitment looks like very different things to different sized brands. We see smaller brands who are, interested in turning over full core fabrics to recycled materials. We see bigger brands who are only looking to maybe turn over a very small percentage to recycled materials. So I definitely think for us, we're not ruling, anyone out. I think the most important thing is that there is a path to scale, and there's that willingness to go from pilot to something long-term, and to really see a vision of this inside your company, to see this being something that you're committed to in the longer term. And that is part of why we, worked on Fiber Club, because from CANOPY, from Fashion for Good, we saw that there's smaller, medium-sized businesses who were looking to really figure out a path to pilot and scale this within their brands.
Yeah, thanks. So we've got like a minute and a half left. And so Priyanka, there's a question here about whether other innovators could join Fiber Club. And so, it probably shouldn't be on the back of Circ, who's trying to scale to make it possible for every other innovator, but maybe for you, maybe that's your task.
I think when we started this journey with Circ, which they conceptualized this, the idea was always from Circ's point as well, as a visionary innovator, to have more and more innovators use this structure. And I think that's the role that we take at Fiber Club, working with Circ in the current Circ Fiber Club, but also seeing who more can we catalyze, how can we use and basically make sure that this model is replicated again and again. So I think after this panel, you'll also hear one more Fiber Club that is coming, and hopefully in this year, we are able to bring 3 or 4 more. That's a bit ambitious, but we'll see. So if you are innovators here who want to work with us on the Fiber Club model, very happy and open to share learnings that have come via Circ, as well as all the stuff that has come from our partners as well. But also if you have brands who are looking to work with other materials where you feel pooling the demand is going to be useful, very happy to work with you as well. So yeah, please reach out if this is of interest.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation with you, and I want to thank the panelists here. So Nicklas Borgen from Upward, whose platform will enable more SMEs to be able to connect with, all the way down through the supply chain. Congratulations to Circ on the announcement of the first facility that they're going to build in France, and on the development of Fiber Club. May it be successful beyond your dreams. To Fashion for Good for the enabling work of thought leadership in this space. I'm Valerie Langer with CANOPY, who's working across the supply chain, mainly on man-made cellulosics. And thanks to all of you for your interest and your actions, and to the next steps that we will all take together when any one of us takes a step towards circularity. It floats everybody else's boats too, which is what we're looking forward to, that collective success. So thanks very much. And we'll hand for everyone.